Welcome everyone. My name is Cindy Wallace. I'm with the Amarillo Public Library, and today I'm so excited to get to show you some quilting tips, and we're going to make a simple quilt block. So the supplies we're going to need today are pretty common sense, but I have a couple of nice little tricks to use with some unexpected materials as well. So the common sense things would be, if we're going to sew a quilt block, we're going to need a sewing machine. I need to be able to produce a scant 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to talk you through that one and show you one of my very best tips. This will involve unexpectedly washi tape. You'll need pin cushions, scissors, possibly a pencil. I often clean my sewing machine. Yes, I know it looks like a makeup brush, but this is how I keep my sewing machine very clean. Tweezers are common, definitely a pin cushion. I also am going to recommend, as we begin, that you have, if at all possible, a small iron and at least a folded up towel. I'm going to use a pad that I use right next to my home sewing machine. I also have done it here in the library as well, but when I'm sewing little squares, I often need to press a seam. Sometimes I finger press, sometimes I need a little hot iron. No steam in quilting, but I want to show you, I'm going to walk you through it, exactly how I carry out a simple quilt block. So let's start with our little pieces to our block that we're going to be sewing together. I've got 16 different, hopefully different, 3.5 by 3.5 inch blocks pre-cut. If you've got a scrap box, this is a great time to just cut things in 3.5 by 3.5 or 4 by 4, however big you want your block to be. But see how I have these laid out? I purposely laid them out and looked at them. Even though it's a scrappy block, I care that I don't sew this orange to that orange. It doesn't look too bad to have a dark blue next to this light blue, but I might not want that yellow against that mostly yellow background. So I have fussy arranged these a little bit while still creating a scrappy look, literally from nice quality scraps. Now the first thing you want to do once you get this laid out, this is a great start, but I want to know that you can do a scant 1/4 inch seam. So you can take a ruler and you can literally draw a line. That one's been done. I'll show you how I taught my granddaughters to do this when we first started. But you can literally draw a 1/4 inch. Get one little line going here because I have a real important point to make to you about this 1/4 inch. So get your 1/4 inch. It's okay to lightly draw it with just plain old pencil. Get you a 1/4 inch line, kind of going down your piece, especially if you're just getting started or want to learn how to do a scant 1/4 inch, because my important point is this. Wherever that line is, if you've measured that 1/4 inch, hopefully that's pretty close to an exact 1/4 inch. Just think about this. If I sew on this side of that line, it's a little more than a 1/4 inch. If I sew right on the line, theoretically it's exactly a 1/4 inch. But when you go to folding pieces of fabric over where you have sewn it together and created a seam, that takes up fabric. So the truth is, even if you have, and I do, beautiful 1/4 inch feet that I love, the truth is a scant 1/4 inch is created by just slightly, just barely sewing on this side, the inside of that 1/4 inch seam line. Okay, how do I get that and be consistent for my block so it turns out exactly like I want? Well, that's what happens over here at the machine, and why in the intro I thought you might want to know about something like washi tape. I've used all sorts of things through the years. The idea is right here on this particular machine. There's a red says 1/4 inch line, and that's great. I've tested it. My needle is in the center position. It's just great. And I have put the washi tape as an extension, carefully following the line of that suggested 1/4 inch seam, but I want you at home to be able to try it and test it. So instead of, now I do line it up with that red line, I'm doing it right now, but when I'm actually sewing, I'm kind of lining it up to land on the rather inside of a line. So here we go. Now I will tell you from experience that when you get to the end, people tend to either go too narrow or too fat just because they're excited and they're getting towards the end. But you can always do it. You can hardly see that pencil line. You can test yourself and go, okay, did I actually create a 1/4 inch seam? Yes, I did. It's perfect. That's not quite the end of the testing, because after you get further along and we begin pressing, what's going to matter is if I had a 3.5 and a 3.5, and I've given up a 1/4 inch, I've now produced 3-inch blocks. You lose a little bit as you sew it up. In the end, we're going to be producing a 12.5 inch big block by using scant 1/4 inch seams, and I tried to do some of these samples in darker threads for comparison so that you could see. That one had a black bobbin thread, but the idea is test. See if it needs to be on the line or just to the inside of the line, and then stop and measure. Actually go ahead, press it open and measure it like this to see if you have stayed within, see that 6 1/4 that I've created. Okay, let's test this one that we just did. We just ran through the machine. I'm kind of pressing it open with my fingers. I'm stretching it a tiny bit, but I'm lining it up and I have 6 1/4. So I'm prepared to test a few times until I'm confident that I'm using a scant 1/4 inch seam, which is going to affect the entire block. Once I've got that done, it's time to have fun learning how to chain. That's one of the things I was excited to show you today. Now that we've talked a little bit about the fun part, which is laying out your colored blocks, getting them kind of arranged a little bit, even though it's a scrappy quilt block that we're working on, it's time to move on to chaining. So as you can see by this sample purple here, which it's white on one side, that won't show on the white tablecloth, so I turned it over and showed you the purple. I did it with a darker thread so you could see what I'm talking about when I say chaining. What I mean is I'm going to be sewing squares of fabric through the machine and never stopping and cutting on purpose. It makes sewing go so much faster. But in a block like this, a simple block, you can chain many pieces like this, and the quilt block will actually be put together and you will never have even stopped to iron. I've tested it, it works great. I think it's a great tip to pass along to you. So with the idea being that I'm going to sew multiple little blocks and not stop and cut in between them, I've got this one partially sewn together. We're fixing to put this on the machine and we're going to sew this to this, this to this, this to this, this to this, and then we're going to sew rows together. So let's get started. I'm picking it up, lining it up, going for that first block at the top. You may notice, and I'm a big pinner, guys, but I can do this one without pinning anything. I just got to be a little careful. Okay, these three are going to be in order and we're going to chain it all together like that light purple sample. Lining it up on the machine, watching that red scant 1/4 inch that I want to create, and here we go. Picking up the next one, open that up, lay one on top of the other carefully, and keep sewing. Next block, lay it on top. Make sure everything is lined up real decent. Watching that scant 1/4 inch line. And I sewed 2 or 3 stitches, but not much, just a couple stitches beyond, without raising the presser foot, without cutting for sure. Lining my block up, scooting it under the presser foot. Scant 1/4 inch seams. Now I'm raising the presser foot. This time I'm going to cut because I have to lay it out to show you the next step. So we chained, we did this. Now look, we have a whole block. I had partially done it, but this time I have added that last row and chained it to itself. Now I have a mostly put together block. Pretty easy. The threads are holding it together for me. Now I'm going to lay this row on top of this row. And you know, I mentioned not creating a knot of fabric. This is where the secret to that part comes in. Again, it's all done for me, so I don't feel like I normally might, that I might have to pin. But watch what I'm going to do. See how I have a seam going on each side? Whichever direction you want one to go, make the other seam, like this top seam, make that one go the opposite direction. I'm lining my pieces up. I'm fixing to do the whole top and second row on the machine, keeping good hold of my fabric. But it really matters that I have the seam sandwiched together. It feels nice and flat. It does not feel like a knot. And I'm going to do that scant 1/4 inch seam right through it. I get through that seam and then I worry about the next one. Okay, if I've got, see that seam's going that way, I want all the seams on top to go, in this case, away from me, the seam on the bottom to go towards me, and I'm lining that seam up pretty carefully. I'm used to feeling it. It just feels nice and flat. It does not feel like a knot or a wad of fabric, which is why you want the seams to go opposite directions. Get through the seam, stop, make sure everything's lined up and it's going to be going the direction you wanted. Lining up my fabric, feeling with my hands, making sure everything feels good. This is how you get good points when you're putting things together. Get through that seam, then worry about piecing everything carefully with that fairly scant 1/4 inch seam. Now I have sewn the top row and the second row together. That part's done. Yay us! So you just continue down the line and I'm going to sew this row to this row and then this row to this row because hey, they're already hooked up anyway, so I can't go changing that now. So literally, let's take a minute and let's sew the third and fourth row together. Then we're going to talk about pressing seams. Okay, so I have several samples that I want to show you because I have different little back tips to teach you. We started out with, that was the order that we had things going from beginning. Now you may have noticed that it looks a little smaller. That's because we've taken all these seams, but we're fixing to sort of stretch it back out a bit by the way we handle the back of the quilt. So that's going to be our next step, is what you do with the back of that quilt block when we haven't ironed anything so far. Now that we have sewn everything together carefully, I've got several different samples to show you because I wanted to give you some tips and some choices for putting a simple quilt block like this together. So in this case, you might notice that row to row, see how this seam, all these seams are pointing to the left? Okay, sometimes you accidentally have something going to the left on the next one as well, and my tip to teach you is to very carefully clip near that seam so that you don't end up with that famous wad or knot of fabric at these intersections. They lay nice and flat, they look beautiful on a finished quilt, so I'm literally showing you what could be done if you accidentally got the seams going all the same way. Better, however, up here where these seams are going to the left and these second row seams are going to the right, that's what you're really after, for this to lay nice and flat right there, and right there. It'll happen again as soon as I sew more blocks to either side of the quilt. So see, disaster averted. No one will ever know when your quilt is put together, but I wanted to show you this can happen. It does to every sewer, but the idea would be to have all the seams as best you can going opposite directions from row to row. Now, notice that these are all pressed to the side. Let's take a look at this sample. This is an option as well. You could, there's the front for you, made out of the same fabric pieces or similar to what we did today. But look at this sample. You can turn it maybe this way for the camera. Now this sample is sewn the same way. The rows go all in the same direction, opposite direction, but this takes a lot more time, and you find this more commonly in home dec, clothing especially, which uses a wider seam than a 1/4 inch. You use 1/2 to 3/8 inch seams on a lot of things, but 1/4 inch is very common in quilting. But look, it took me quite a bit of time to stand there with that little iron and press this open. Well, that's nice. It makes it lie nice and flat, but this is time consuming when you're producing blocks and blocks for a quilt. It's great. There's nothing wrong with it. I know people who do this on a regular basis. It's nice because things are going this way, this way, this way, that way, that way, that way, and they sewed together beautifully. No knots. I mean, if you touch it with your finger, it is perfectly flat. It's just wonderful. So you could press those seams open like that. Does it make any difference on the other side of your quilt? Not really. What you're looking for, and I'll show you good and bad, is you want your points from when you originally put those squares together, that's called a point, and you want your squares to meet nice. There's all 4 there, meeting pretty nicely. Occasionally, and this is an example of, oh, those points don't meet perfectly right there. Maybe I didn't pull on it enough when I was sewing it. So that one to me is it'll be okay, it's a scrappy quilt, but if it was terribly important to me, you better believe I'd be unstitching that. This one's a little closer. This one is really close. I think it's about perfect, and it doesn't show anyway because it gets blended in there. Because this was a solid color against a dark, that was an easy one to teach you from. But your goal would be as close to on point, like this, point to point, as you can manage. Now let's look at another one. This is a different but same fabric, scrappy quilt, made the same way. This one was pieced together using the chaining technique that I taught you today, and it pressed out beautifully. Just take a look. Everything going this direction, everything going that direction, and vice versa, row after row. And then, instead of pressing them open, I just pressed this way. Look how this is coming towards you, coming towards you, coming towards you. It pressed beautifully, it measured out perfectly, and this was done without ever ironing along the way, as so many of us quilters do. Look at it, it's just as pretty on the front as you could possibly hope for. Did I trim it a tiny bit? You bet I did. I had a piece or two that were just a fraction of a little bit off. It won't make a bit of difference, but yes, I did trim it so it'd be pretty for the camera. Don't think that that never happens to a quilter, because it does. So let's take a look at today's. This is the one. Let me get it. Here's how we had it. That's how we started with it today. There's the strings that I normally would cut as I go. You can see it hasn't been ironed yet, and you can see that there'll be a little trimming before we're done. That's the way things really do work out. Let's just flip it over. And let's see what we've got that we might have to work with, correct. What do I need to do, if anything? So this will be real good learning experience for you. Okay, look at the way you want things to roll back and forth. You can usually do maybe 2 at a time, and if you have to, it's a good opportunity for me to show you that you might, that one didn't come out just right. Sorry, I'm having to reach, guys. It's a good opportunity for me to show you if you have to, you can clip. It was the reason I stopped for a minute there as we were sewing a while ago. So right this second, I'm not doing the big seams, I'm doing these little ones in the squares, just showing you that the idea is that they all go one direction and then the opposite direction on the next row. Worked out pretty well. But if for any reason they don't work out that way, I want you to be comfortable just taking your I like little tiny, very sharp scissors. If ever they don't work, I want you to feel comfortable just making a snip, but not actually cutting any threads. That's a lifesaver trick to be told it's okay to do. Then, when everything is pressed one direction, my recommendation is that you press the whole quilt. See how I'm pressing now away from me? This is the first row sewn to the second row, the third row, and then the fourth row. And this was like the sample that I prepared yesterday, so I'd have a finished one to show you. But you can see, I really kind of like my quilt. I was taught that it should be as pretty on the back, as professional as possible, as it is on the front. And I can tell you this from having taken it to my quilters for years. Quilters often won't accept your quilt if it's got a bunch of trimming, threads, etc., that need to be cleaned up. So I was kind of trained early on to have my quilt block, before I even sewed it to the next quilt block, everything should be looking pretty good. Do I have a tiny bit of trimming? You bet I do. Will it hurt my block? Not one bit. So you can see, we carefully, and no steam, just a dry iron, not a lot of stretching. But now, this quilt block that we did here in class today is as pretty on the front and the back as you could ask for. So this is our finished quilt block. Doesn't it look terrific? Full of lively, bright, fun color. Gonna make a gorgeous quilt when we make several of these up. We're so glad that you were here, participated with us today. We hope that you'll come back for more. Give us the thumbs up, like, subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Bye, guys.